All right, so hello and welcome to another episode of the ICC Academy COVID-19 Briefing, an interactive video series where we explore the economic and health implications of this coronavirus pandemic and what must be done to ensure successful recovery for businesses big and small. I'm your host, Thomas Paris, and in this episode, we will discuss the latest developments on testing, immunity, risk profiling, and how to manage risk as companies go back to the office. We have another full house of special guests today. The first is John Denton, Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce, Dr. Dale Fisher, Chair of the World Health Organization's Global Outbreak Alert and Response Network, Dr. Chester Drum, Assistant Professor of Medicine and Senior Consultant at the NUS Young Lin School of Medicine, and Dr. Joanne Yoong, Senior Economist and Director for the Center for Economic and Social Research in Washington, D.C. And finally, our moderator for today is Dorjee Sun, CEO of Perlin.net and returning speaker for ICC Academy. So these briefings will kick off our collaboration between the ICC, the United Nations, and the World Health Organization. During the session, we will start by running through a few topics, followed by an audience Q&A. So we invite everyone to send your questions in the chat, and we'll go through them together near the end. So let's kick things off. Dorjee, over to you.
Thank you so much, Thomas. So first of all, thank you everyone for attending. This was a panel which is very exciting because of the representatives. So on the one hand, you've got, as was mentioned, John, who is the institutional voice for 45 million businesses. And, as the Secretary General of the ICC, I'm an advisor to John, but I've got to work with him across a number of different initiatives. And very few initiatives are as globally encompassing as COVID-19. And then also institutionally, the voice from the WHO with Dale Fisher, who also is based in Singapore, is also a tremendous privilege, working obviously in a number of university hospitals and the health system. We're also going to dovetail that with an economics perspective. So Joanne, again, Dr. Joanne Yoong is also a senior economist who'll be able to talk through some of the modeling around the implications of COVID-19. And then obviously as well with another medical voice, Dr. Chester Drum, Assistant Professor of Medicine and Senior Consultant. He'll also be talking about patient advocacy and some of the implications of the governance changes. So what's really fascinating about this panel, I think that it covers a lot of different aspects of what we feel in the cycle seems to be drawing towards, what happens next. So if you think about it in context, it's only 3 months really since the Wuhan lockdown on the 23rd of January, but so much has changed. When you look at the actual numbers on infections, the case numbers have now exceeded 3.15 million. The number of fatalities is now over 220,000. If you look at the US, their numbers are now in excess of 1 million cases with 50,000 dead. So much has changed in 3 months, but it does now start feeling like the shift of focus from lives to livelihoods is now leading us towards the question of what next. So the topic today that we're going to be discussing is the return to work. We're going to also be touching on how we can potentially manage that risk. And when you look at the participants, the people who have attended, please, very rarely do we have access to so much experience and knowledge. So please feel free to put your questions in. We've already received over 50 questions previous to starting the webinar, and so I'll be also feeding some questions in through to the speakers. But this is very much more of a conversation rather than about presentations. So with that, I thought I'd start off with John. Obviously, you're in Paris. France is now reopening on the 11th of May. Actually, when you look at the projections, they're talking about the 2nd of June for restaurants and social life. Just wanted to start off by giving you the microphone to tell us a bit about how the ICC is traveling and what it sees as the challenges with this global pandemic and situation.
Oh, look, thanks very much, Dorjee, and great to be on the panel. Super excited to be able to chat with people, but also as well as get different perspectives. The interesting thing from my perspective is that this is not a globally coordinated crisis. This is not a crisis which has said we'll sequence this. We'll start in the north and we'll move a little bit to the east, move a little bit to the west. What you've actually got is a different paces and different levels of intensity with the way in which the COVID-19 crisis is unfolding. And the reason I say that is, in the one hand, we're talking in some places about return to work. In other places, we're talking about stopping people from stopping work, talking about reopening businesses. We're talking about stopping businesses closing. There's actually lots of different things happening. And as the institutional voice of 45 million businesses, we're talking partly for the global north and the global south. And so often in the global south, you've actually had the economic impact of COVID-19 before you've actually had the full impact of the health crisis. So this is a non-synchronized crisis, and it requires, I think, a lot of humility in dealing with it, but also clear clarity around the principles you want to apply to a global level for grappling with it. So at the ICC, we see our role in a number of levels. The first is we are the trusted partner when people want to engage with the private sector for global policy issues. But increasingly, we're seeing our role as on a regional level and actually country specific, for the very reason I articulated before. This is not synchronized. And so therefore, the interventions we're making at the moment, for example, in the South Pacific, are different from the interventions we're making now in Europe or in France, where the conversation is, as you say, rightly shifting to deconfinement, gradual, what that might look like, how do you actually get people back to work. In other cases, we've got a humanitarian crisis in, for example, Beirut or in Lebanon as a consequence of COVID, but the actual impact of the actual health crisis is much less. It's the economic impact combining with another set of elements. So we need to be very clear, I think, about one of the challenge of grappling with this on a global basis. So bringing a number of different, I think, lenses to the way in which we approach the crisis. From our perspective, we are the voice of global business. Our aim is always to be a trusted partner of all the key participants in this. As I said, this is a crisis of not just of a humanitarian level, but of the real economy. And because we represent so many businesses, large and small and very small, we're able to bring that voice of the real economy. It requires us also to be close and understand the various nuances of it. So we bring that voice to the institutional responses by, for example, with the WHO, with the G20. So we were the first business group at a formal level to actually engage with the WHO. In fact, I'm glad Dale's here, because one of the observations we made, which actually caused me to reach out to the WHO, was that there wasn't enough engagement with the private sector in the way in which the pandemic was being grappled with, and not enough real-time information, not enough accurate dissemination of information broadly enough through various economies. And actually, I'll show you I'll talk about some data we've got to sort of back that up in a second. So we reach out to the WHO, and together with the WHO, we actually work with the B20, when we convened called for the convening of the virtual G20 on particular issues to do with ensuring there was proper trade flows, that we maintained trade flows, that there was a stop to the blockage of essential goods and services flowing through. We also then worked with other groups and got very focused with international financial institutions to ensure that developing countries weren't going to be stymied by debt repayments, forcing them to actually make a choice between maintaining their health systems and repaying debt. And so I think together with the international trade union movement we work with and civil society, we were able to prevail upon, along with others, G20 countries, but also enabling international financial institutions. We've now been grappling with multilateral development banks, with the various UN commissions in the various regions, so going from that global level to the more specific level around the various regions about how we can get access to finance, particularly to save the real economy. And again, in some cases, it's to help businesses reopen. In others, it's to actually stop them closing. So looking at new alternate methodologies are being used for that as well. Importantly, as you say, we've been trying to ensure that the discussion is primarily and essentially, as it should be, focused on saving lives. But we also talk about the need to preserve lives and livelihoods, and we don't think it's an either or. So we've also been working a lot to ensure that we can support this kind of gradual return to work and make it easier, because one of the challenges we're going to see, and you're already seeing that in Europe, different standards emerging from what's expected. You're seeing stuff coming out of Chile. You're seeing lots of different approaches emerging. We actually want, as a global standard setter, because at the end of the day, we're a not-for-profit institution, the voice of 45 million businesses. We've got our own courts. We set standards that the world can cover, world can rely upon when governments can't act. We want to ensure that we're doing that in this area as well. So we've been exploring different tools that we can use to enable that as well. Importantly, one of the most interesting things we've been working on at the moment has been a survey with the. So I'm just going to try and find my notes on it. A survey on behalf of the WHO. This is the first whole of globe survey of businesses' responses to the COVID crisis. And I'll just try and pull up some of the data because it's actually quite interesting. We've got we're on the way to having almost 10,000 responses from more than 150 countries, from businesses large and very, very small. In fact, one of the greatest imprints we've had in terms of the survey has been on SMEs and micro SMEs, which just tells you how important that is to a number of companies to actually get involved in this discussion. And what we're finding is that most businesses are relying on their local governments for advice. There is actually a huge relevance for WHO. We found is that the second most relied upon is actually the WHO. The third has been advice from company boards, etc. But interestingly, in getting information, there's actually a difference from region as well. So in Latin America, there's a lot more reliance on social media than on traditional press. So it's actually some quite interesting material coming out. And the reason that's useful, as we go along in dealing with this crisis, one of the benefits, I think, of these kind of surveys, and we'll be completing it in about another 10 days' time, so these are just some very high-level numbers, we'll be able to help the WHO understand the better way of communicating in order to get its messages out and what the pressing issues are for businesses, large and small, in the various regions. So from our perspective, the way in which we're focused is threefold at the moment. One is just helping companies get through this. The second is actually helping build policy frameworks, looking at standards to enable the return to work. And the third is actually going to be what is Build Back Better, what does this recovery look like as well. So looking at all those issues, as I said, this is not a neatly synchronized crisis. So we're actually grappling all those issues simultaneously. And we operate from a policy level, so sort of coordinating at the global level, coordinating at the regional level, and coordinating at the country level, but being driven all the time by real-time information from companies.
Thank you, John. I think what was fascinating for Dale, and love to get your thoughts. Do you feel there is a disconnect between some of the policy?
Lost the sound.
Okay, we can hear you, but Dale. So I think, do you feel that there is a disconnect, or there is any sort of misalignment between some of the policy making and some of the economic projections, and most importantly, maybe if you would care to give us a bit of an intro in terms of where the WHO and where you feel that the current developments around COVID-19 stand? What are we kind of looking at?
So
I can hear you now. Sorry.
So just to be clear, I don't work for the WHO. I work for National University of Singapore and National University Hospital in Singapore, but I do chair one of the WHO major networks, which is the Global Outbreak Alert Response Network. And that's an organization of about 260 outbreak or organizations that are involved in outbreak response. So these are big and small groups. It could be all the CDCs, basically. So CDC from US, CDC Africa, Nigeria, China. They're all members, International Federation of Red Crosses, UNICEF. So these are what we'd call the big players, Médecins Sans Frontières. But and there's about 6 or 8, I think, in Singapore that are partners as well. Which includes National University of Singapore. So that's where I come from. When you ask about disconnects and things, I think it's easy to forget how short a time this has been. We came back from the technical mission in China on February the 25th or 6th, I think. It was, we're talking about 2 months ago, and that was the technical mission that went into China to learn about things like, transmission, severity, some of the interventions and treatments that were being used in China, and we came up with a report that is now fairly well known. So I think when you talk about disconnects and things, we're still just starting this off. If you asked me that question in 6 months and there was poor communication, I'd say, yeah, this is really poor. But no, I think we're just all settling in now. I think the public, by and large, across the world now gets it, but obviously that's not uniform. But that's been a major issue in the past as people, understand the implications of public health needs, which are you may have to go into quarantine, you may have to go into isolation for the public good. Most countries in the world, this was a very foreign concept, but I think now people understand that when you've got basically bodies piling up in your emergency departments and your hospitals, people are and therefore you had to lock down. People are seeing that was a really extreme response, and we don't want to have to go there again. So let's have a second crack at this. Let's open up gradually. Let's work out how we can do this safely, because we don't want to go back. On the mission, we were kind of ambitious that the world might see what happened in China and how a virus brought 1.4 billion people, and a huge country essentially to its knees. But the rest of the world didn't get that, and I understand that. It's sort of just so crazy. But now everyone's had a taste. Some have locked down quickly. Some have locked down stepwise. Some have locked down late, and they had real problems. And as John says, therefore now everyone is out of phase, and everyone's got their own different outbreak setting, and that's based on the context. How fragile is your health system? How fragile is your economy? How much trust is in government? All these different, and how the communications was undertaken, and what's the sort of psyche of the community involved. And all these have directed each country, even each province, each state, probably each town, has got their own little outbreak, their own response. And again, as John said, this is not a world response. This is millions of sub-responses. And in Singapore, as you know, we've got 2 completely different outbreaks going on. And this happens. This is happening across the world. So no, I don't think there's a disconnect actually between business and public health. I think generally businesses want health, and I think public health people want businesses and successful economies. And I actually, this is one of the things I'm more confident about now is that everyone gets it. Public health people do not believe in shutdowns, but unfortunately, to date, it's been a necessary evil. We're going to learn a lot. We're going to learn a lot from China as it gradually unlocks. Australia, New Zealand, and a few other countries locked very early, and now they're unlocking. So they're almost in the same phase as China. But then there's others that are unlocking arguably prematurely. So we're going to learn a lot, and there's going to be a lot of twists and turns coming up.
Yeah, and I guess just to stress on the. Actually, I think there's a bit of feedback. Can anyone potentially mute if they hear the feedback? Okay. So what I was just saying is, so do you feel like, for example, when you talk about New Zealand, there seems to be a tremendous amount of confidence. Some of the terminology that they're using. And when you talk about millions of micro responses, do you think that not so much that there is a misalignment, but I guess are people potentially prematurely underestimating the potential resurgence? Some of the governments, for example, the White House released some strategies around how they saw going back to work and the gating criteria, and it seemed to be, in phase 1 they were talking about potentially opening up sporting grounds and religious churches, places of quite a high density of people. even gyms were being contemplated to be being opened, in phase 2. So I guess, do you feel that potentially there's a risk of there being resurgence of the virus, or public policy potentially being overly confident or not taking the health data into consideration enough?
So do I think there's any risk? Yeah. Of course, there's a lot of risk floating around. But, this is a time when leadership is more important than ever before. To open up things, so any society is going to have to look at what's important to that society, socially, culturally, economically. And some, I think Iran is opening up mosques on Fridays, So they have to work out how to do that safely. That's tremendously important to that country. How are they going to provide distancing and hand wash and improve ventilation inside, mask wearing, whatever interventions you can come to make it satisfactory is, in the US and Australia, I know sport's going to be very important, and you have to give the people something. You can't say, no, I don't like sport. If this is deemed to be culturally important, you have to work out how to do it safely. And it's going to be the same with businesses. Obviously businesses are tremendously important economically, and that's going to be the secret, not just say shut down and come back when there's a vaccine. It's going to be, okay, let's work out which are the main drivers of the economy, who's hurting the most, whatever priorities that country or state or province or town wants to make, and work out how to do it safely. It can be done safely. This is not binary shut down or open your doors.
Thank you. I think that actually is a great lead in with Joanne, because when you do the economic modeling in terms of the reopening of economies, when you look at some of the comments that Dale just made in terms of businesses being able to come back online safely, that actually in some ways flies in the face of some of the public media that says we need a vaccine, or the world won't go back to normal until certain cures or certain scientific amount of testing, serology testing, things like that are robust. But coming back to the economics, as an applied microeconomic specialist, do you see when you look at the economic models rolling pandemics or extended periods of lockdown, or do you see there being, for example, people talking about the long U, the sharp V? How do you kind of look at the world?
The swoosh, all of the other things. I think, just coming back to what I think both John and Dale have said before, I think one of the things that we're looking at is clearly when it comes to economic modeling, every model is wrong, right? Models are not reality. Models are stylized representations of ways that we think the world might work in order to give us some insights. And so the fact of the matter is that I think a lot of people are learning very quickly about epidemiological modeling in ways that they never thought before. And the uncertainties inherent in those models, as well as the economic models. Dale and I have had this conversation before. Economists and public health people often write their models in tandem, but don't speak to each other, and that's something that's changing, I think, very rapidly today. But what we do see is that I think that it is an uncoordinated crisis, but we find that these effects are in fact global. So what we're seeing is a crisis on the macro level that is going to hit us harder, and I think that we do have that consensus, than probably any recession we've seen since the Great Depression. We are seeing that the effects are not spread evenly around the world, and that some regions are going to be much more affected than others. So that's something that we know, I think, and we've held in consensus. Apart from that, we are seeing very large differences in how people are choosing to model that recession. Again, driven by a lot of the uncertainties inherent in the epidemiological modeling. We really do not know at this moment, and I want to underline exactly what Dale has said. We don't know what the long-term consequences of COVID-19 are because we have not seen anything that can be interpreted as the long-term consequences of COVID-19. And so when we have forecasts that look towards next year, everything that we have about a recovery is contingent on very wide confidence intervals about what that disease scenario might look like going forward for next year. The other thing I'd like to sort of say is that, we're thinking about coming back from a recession, but there will not be any sense we are coming back to a normal, right? That's not going to happen even in a V scenario. I think what we have to understand is that we are adjusting to a new normal in which the ways in which we do business are going to be radically different, in which the ways in which we are online, the ways that we are relating, and the ways in which, I want to come back again to what Dale has said, in which we lead are radically important. And what I think is so important and not captured in any of these models is the quality of leadership and the ability and trust of people to set up systems in which we can monitor very closely the process of opening up and change direction if we have to. So that quantity of leadership and trust is something that is, I think, not captured in any of the models that we have today, but is going to be so vital to understanding resilience in the long term.
So to the question of leadership and trust, do you see from a macroeconomic perspective, and if you'd be able to give a little bit more color? I mean, I think everyone in the world, if you look at the trust levels on both media as well as politicians, with a few exceptions, they're not really trending the right way. Looking at, for example, the disconnect in terms of understanding, a lot of people seem to talk about it being the worst depression in known history, but yet the equities markets, the stock markets, may not reflect that. There seems to still be a bit of a lag in terms of the understanding of what the consequences could be. And then the second part, so question one would be, could you give a bit more color around what you see as, the potential downside or the potential risks for the audience watching tonight, as well as, from a stimulus perspective, you've seen huge amounts of stimulus. Is that what's propping up buoyancy? Is that the type of leadership you're talking about? If you could give a bit more color, please.
For both, okay. Well, part of it, I think, is when I'm talking about leadership, I'm talking about the way that, for example, we actually respond to policy changes is actually very critically dependent on how the population understands those messages and the trust that they have that we're doing things the right way, that the government is actually implementing the right thing at the right time, given the information that they have. So when we look at Sweden, for example, people will say Sweden never had a lockdown. But if we actually look at mobility patterns and traffic patterns and the number of people who actually stopped going as frequently to businesses, we actually see, in some sense, a very high compliance with measures that were not formally speaking a lockdown. But we see in other places where lockdowns are announced and we see behavioral responses that are much less compliant. And so at that level, I think the right monitoring in place, but also it has the trust of the population is actually going to dictate how well these measures work and what the actual implications are for the economy. That's one thing. The second thing is that the form of stimulus is so important, right? If we have a sharp comeback and everyone is floating on credit, that's one story. But if we have a prolonged comeback and everyone again is floating on credit and not grants, that's going to be very challenging for us in the short term. What I'm going to say here is also reflecting me. I think you mentioned that I'm a researcher. I run a research center at the University of Southern California. I'm also visiting the National University of Singapore, probably indefinitely at this point. But I also have a social enterprise. We are a micro business of 4. And we think every day about what it means to take a loan. We think every day about what it means to survive this. We've gone online. We are trying to make research services available on a digital platform. But on one hand, we have stimulus packages that are available to us, but the choice of what to take up at this moment is very critical. We have not taken a loan. We are living on cash as long as we possibly can because we are facing so much uncertainty. That's a choice that we have because we had a large cash reserve. But in Asia, we have 90% of our businesses are micro or small businesses. And many of us only have cash flow that lasts us 1 or 2 months. And so if we are not able to access those stimulus funds or those stimulus funds are not coming down to the micro small businesses, at the end of the day, we're not going to survive. And what we're going to be talking about here is not helping us to get through or resuscitating us, but actually talking about large segments of the economy, things that are culturally important to us that may have disappeared forever. And bringing those back is going to be a much more difficult road. So I think the form of stimulus, the access to stimulus is actually very important.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely, from our experience, again, by a couple of things, just from the data we pulled together from this extraordinary survey, we shouldn't underestimate the importance of government leadership in this context. The universal response when asked from where do you get your information is actually national governments. The role of national governments in that leadership is actually critical. The interesting thing is how much lower down the rank is reliance on media and social media, which may actually not be the way some people are calling this at the moment. So reliance on governments. As Dale said, one of the truths I think that will emerge from this is if you look at the troika here, if you have a functioning health system, if you have functioning governance, and if you have strong community affiliation, these are all positives. If you don't have any of those, if you have poor governance, poor health system, and poor community affiliation, this is you're kind of exposed to the blowtorch here. And the other thing that we're seeing, and this is one really important issue for us, is that you can't use the playbook from the global financial crisis to grapple with this macroeconomic shock. This is a real economy shock, which is why it's so important to understand the real economy is really SMEs and micro SMEs. And obviously Asia, it's critical, but in Africa as well. And I see there's someone in the line from Yemen, etc. So what we're trying to do is ensure that the funds get made available as quickly as possible directly to the SMEs and micro SMEs. But let's also not forget, in a number of these economies, there's a huge informal sector. So we also have to make certain that governments are able to maintain social welfare systems and actually maintain some level of support for broader populations in this as well. So we see that as part of our role. We also see that a number of governments are not using the right playbook. And the thing that has been most surprising, which maybe is the black swan in this, a pandemic is not a black swan, it's always been anticipated. The black swan here has been the lack of coordinated international action. So if you make a country-specific fiscal intervention, if it's not part of a broader macro affiliated set of actions, it can actually be a lot of money spent very, very badly, which is the lack of global coordination has been the bit, I think, which we might look back and say is the black swan. And maybe, and hopefully we can say that was stage one. Stage two will move to much more macro coordination across the world.
So I'll pick up that thread, and actually I'll go back to Dale quickly, because to both your comments, Joe and also John, when you talk about confidence, I mean, governments can give as much transparency, great leadership, no matter how great some of the national leadership may be, ultimately it does come back to science. Because if you think about the informal economy, people aren't going to go back to a lot of the, whether it's food and beverages, whether it's services, people won't go if there is a risk or a fear that they may be, severely, whether it's a respiratory, whether it's a blood clot and an amputation, some of the yet specified but still unknown causes or symptoms of this illness. I guess coming back to the science, Dale, no matter what the leadership seems to be, do you think that the informal economy really can move forward without a few key sort of milestones being reached? And in your opinion, what are those milestones? Whether are you thinking in terms of obviously immunization or some type of vaccine, a cure, or even just systemic testing where people have enough confidence that someone may have a trustworthy status? But I guess, just tying back, how can you say that leadership can resuscitate an economy if the science itself is still, yet to provide certainty?
When you're managing an outbreak, we really talk in terms of four major pillars, okay? One is case management, one's epidemiology, another is logistics, and the last one, which is invariably underrated, is risk communications and community engagement. Now, you can't get on top of an outbreak. If an outbreak is going to fail, it's usually because you haven't engaged the community adequately. And so I'm talking Ebola outbreaks, cholera outbreaks, anything. This is how you run an outbreak. So community engagement is critical. People need to understand. People, and with information comes, I guess, confidence and power and an understanding. You don't tell people what's happening, and you'll get a lot of problems on the street. You give them conflicting information. You give them wrong information, and I think we can all think of countries where that's happening now, and it leads to a very chaotic downstream effect. So when you're talking about, you know, vaccines and treatments, you're really focusing on case management, and that's fine. But, you know, you do that, you throw in the epidemiology, so you explain to people, you know, what are your metrics? How do you know there's, you know, that it's safe to do this? Well, it's because we look at cases, but we also look at unlinked cases, for instance. Unlinked cases is a very underrated metric that I think we'll see more of coming out. These are people that you don't know how they got it. Another one is like we do ILI surveillance, that's influenza-like illness. And these are just random people with a mild illness, and we say, oh, let's test them. I don't really think it's COVID. And you do it and they're positive. Now, they would represent unrecognized community transmission. So I guess where I'm going with this is that don't underestimate the power of engaging the community, explaining it to them, reassuring them why it's happening, but also telling them the risk of doing this. And, you know, the risk might be that we need to tweak it back. But, you know, this is a risk we're prepared to take because this is what we want to do. But there's no 100% guarantee. And I think if you talk like that, you know, some heads of state are just marvelous at addressing their communities and getting that buy-in. And I don't know the Sweden situation well, but when Joanne mentioned Sweden, I quickly looked up the Apple mobility data, and it's absolutely right. You know, so they've done it without a lockdown, but it's still the social restrictions in place that are part of a lockdown. So, you know, I think, so my answer is community engagement. We don't need hard things like vaccines. Vaccines will help. That's a wonderful endpoint, but no, there's middle ground in between.
Thank you, Dale. So now to Chester. Obviously, coming to this idea of back to work and talking about risk and talking about engagement of community. Some of the discussions that you've led and some of the work that you're doing around potential solutions or things that we could be working towards, you talked about the different risk profiles. So, for example, as was brought up with the White House guidances, you know, they're seeming to put into phase one both, you know, sporting events, which again, you know, I was mentioning to you, I've been to a Boston ice hockey game, and you know, the density and the droplets were particularly worrisome. And then on the same level, they, for example, were opening up in phase one gyms, but then they chose that bars would only be opened up in phase 3, for example. How would you look at different risk profiles, you know, both from a citizen perspective, because obviously all vulnerable people that maintained should stay, you know, within some form of quarantine until phase 3, and how would you also look at environmental risk in terms of ways of staging return to works and potentially applied to small to medium businesses and viewers tonight?
Yeah, so I too have been to hockey games in Boston. I was there before I moved to Singapore, and I would say at baseline, fluid exchange is a significant risk, even outside of the context of COVID-19. I love Boston, by the way. So, you know, as a physician and someone who does research specifically in the areas of risk prediction for patients, I try and keep it relatively simple. So, you know, you can think of environmental type risks. So, you know, much of the goals of epidemiology and outbreak suppression are to reduce the risk of prevalence of the virus around the world and in a given area, and reduce essentially a societal risk of excess death, strain on resources, et cetera. But those types of strategies aren't necessarily tailored to the individual. I mean, they're tailored to a communal endpoint, really, because, you know, within that population, there's a spectrum of risk of individuals. And so once you start to move out of the phase of wanting to protect a population through appropriate restrictive measures, and you start releasing those restrictive measures, then you start to get into the area of individualized risk assessments. And you'll hear multiple leaders, our own here in Singapore, in the United States, and everywhere, that will say, if you're a little bit older, be a little bit extra careful about going out. So when you say that, you're applying a risk model to the population. You're saying that higher risk people are older, and you're already taking a baby step in terms of how people adapt their personal risk to the environmental risk. So I see as we adapt to a new normal, that risk management and the technologies of risk management are going to become much more important as the economy restarts. And literally, people on an individual basis, and again, this is once a government has decided to relax restrictive measures, when individuals decide to re-engage with the hockey game, with the New York nightclub, this packed brim to brim, or a walk in the park by themselves, I think there's going to be an increased role for people assessing their own risk. And certainly I've had the honor of starting some of those technology discussions with the ICC, so I've gotten to know John just a bit, and that's a bit of an extension of how we've extended some of our work in the laboratory of how we use informatics to predict risk on an individual basis. And the good news is that these types of calculations are highly facilitated by the amount of technology penetrance that's really in the majority of the world at the moment. And certainly that even that didn't really exist during SARS. And that is a different foundation for which to create solutions where people can manage risk both from an institutional level and an individual level to re-engage in economic activity. And I think lastly, since I know there's a lot of business owners listening, if you look at other types of structures where society accommodates individual risk. So, for example, the Americans with Disabilities Act in the United States would be an example of that, where there's a framework for regulations of companies to address risk of customers and employees. Sometimes that's worked well, sometimes it hasn't. But that meet in the middle approach where there are societal accommodations and there are individual risks, I think that it's going to look like that. I mean, even things like immunity passes, that you hear in the news, immunity passes are one subject, but really the reason that's important is because immunity connotes low risk. If there's another way to say that someone's low risk, you can get the same result. And so at the end of the day, I think you're both right that risk is at the element, is at the foundation of what it is we need to solve to re-engage as a community. And certainly the other three speakers each have their own segment of that risk equation, which is essentially the equation that will define success.
So I guess building on that thread, Dale, did you see there being any type of global standard or global types of benchmarks on, COVID clearance status or risk status, or, how, obviously the science is still work in progress, but is there, this also ties back to the, the leadership and the multilateral kind of a concerted approach. Is that what you're seeing evolve or the opposite?
Got to get that right. It's being talked about a lot. The WHO really needs evidence to give a guideline. It doesn't thrive in a speculative type guidance. It's certainly talked about every week on teleconferences that I'm on with high level leaders, and everyone's crying. Pardon me. Everyone's crying out for the guidance, but it doesn't exist. I think it will exist when some evidence appears as to how you can open safely, but But really what I've said before, I think, is the thinking that, you know, it's going to be what's socially, culturally and economically important to you, and try and do it safely, and really try and do it slowly, because it's going to be really tough for any government to unlock a country, have everyone dancing on the street, and then 2 months later lock it down again. I think there'd be a revolution in some countries. So you know, I think that's not a risk. I think everyone's going to go really, really slowly because they're scared.
Yeah, and I guess you know, to John, when you look at this, you know, this guidance, and then you think about how, for example, in America, their businesses, big lobby groups, even the U.S. Chamber of Commerce was asking for litigation protection. So in the absence of there being any guidance, if they are to unlock, so already, for example, there's litigation and criminal investigations, litigation on Walmart for the death of one of their associates near Chicago, you know, Australia, you know, there's criminal investigations about people that were COVID positive that led to deaths in a business. You know, does the ICC see any role for itself, or how do we actually bridge this gap? Because I think coming back to, you know, the resurgence of a robust economy, especially for the informal and the small to medium-sized businesses, I kind of feel like there needs to be some form of framework to avoid litigious action or other types of, like, who bears the risk, you know?
Yeah, well, I mean, great question, and far be it from me to protect the world from US plaintiff lawyers. I think,
I don't think you can
plaintiff lawyers in general, class action lawyers in general, there will be, there's always going to be the risk of legal action. But I'm much more interested, as I said, you know, we're framing this discussion as preserving lives and livelihoods, and that's within that. How do you manage the risk? How do you identify the risk and manage the risk? One of the things I'm very interested in is, can we help somehow in creating standards that can enable that risk to be appropriately identified? And what you don't want is a series of separated, distant or fractured standards emerging in the world. I mean, it would be great if the WHO just agreed to a standard, but the reality is, Dale said, that's not the nature or the role at this point of the WHO. They will ultimately endorse something once it's shown to have been tested. So what we're doing at the moment is looking at, can we create a risk management tool which can be tested? And at the moment, I've reached out to Chile, because it's already looking at this issue, Colombia, where there's actually a very strong informal economy, and actually Turkey. In a way, I'm trying to go, in a sense, left and right hand side of the world to see if they're interested in that kind of pilot. And I know that there are a number of companies that will be interested in that as well. And so as we go along, we will seek to evolve a standard. And given, I think many people would know on this call, because the ICC of itself, we are a standard. I mean, we are 100 years old, we're an institution, we're a not-for-profit, for-purpose. We've already set standards in other parts of the global economy, particularly where governments can't act. Because of the level of trust in us, we can do so, which is why it's important. I said our role is to be a trusted partner here. And we have the added advantage, we have our own courts. So we can not only set standards, we can ultimately govern them as well. So we are looking at that. We think it's going to be very, and of course, there's always going to be litigation risk. I mean, it's just the nature of these things. But, you know, sensible business people and citizens, picking up the earliest discussion, understanding their risk, how much risk they're prepared to tolerate, and how they're prepared to show their tolerance of that and evidence of management of that, will all be critical players, I think, in creating a standard which can ultimately say we're okay in the context we're in to resume work. Again, there's a lot of trust required in this, community engagement required in this, building evidence that this can work. These are all elements that we at the ICC, we think it's critical if we genuinely want to preserve lives and livelihood, that we're actually involved in that discussion. And technology can really help. It's an enabler.
So I'm actually going to try to shift the conversation to more of a growth mindset and opportunities. I mean, on that point, and Joe, I'd love to go to you just to ask you: have you seen any opportunities? You know, obviously, there's always silver linings, and I'd like to address this to everyone on the call, but you know, like from an interesting example was microbreweries that were previously making beers went into hand sanitizers and were making huge amounts of money. You know, Louis Vuitton was making, you know, PPE, personal protective equipment. I mean, it's fascinating. Also, even and later on, coming back to Dale and to John, you know, just looking at how supply chains, you know, the reliance on China as the world's everything. I think that's not going to be possible to maintain given what's happening. The food supply chain, even when you look at business process outsourcing with call centers. You know, would we ever rely again on a single source of that, given the breakdowns because of this unprecedented pandemic? So, question to everyone, and starting with you, Joe, would love to hear: have you seen any opportunities? You know, is there a silver lining, or are we still kind of worried about kind of rolling outbreaks and you know, a bit of push pull in the future?
There we go. So I was going to say that I think those two things are not mutually exclusive. There will always be risk in the system going forward, but at the same time, we do see the silver linings. So one of the areas, obviously, that we've seen is the entire segment of the enablers for remote work. I think is something that's growing very rapidly. We're seeing lots of exciting new solutions about enabling work from home. So that's one. And obviously, the second piece, which we're seeing growing a lot right now, is telehealth and telemedicine. So we're seeing the digital health space really kind of grow. I think a lot of things that we thought were unimaginable in the past actually have become imaginable. So that's an area where we're seeing technologies, telemedicine, where we're seeing delivery of rationalization of supply chains around that. I think all of that is going to come up. And we are also, of course, seeing, I think, in the logistics and logistics area, I think we're going to see a lot of change as well. I think we're also going to see, I think, in terms of food and in the food industry and the food and beverage industry, I really don't know how that's going to pan out, actually. And that's partly because we live in Singapore, where 90% of the reason why I live in Singapore is the local, hyper-local food and beverage industry. But we are seeing a lot of transformation here. I actually don't know where that's going to work out, but I think that we are seeing, in fact, a lot of growth in certain areas and in food delivery and things like that. So we're going to see that. And of course, at this moment, Nintendo, I hear, cannot be gotten for love of money. I've been trying to get a Nintendo Switch in Singapore for the last 3 weeks to save my life from my small children. And let me tell you, that is an industry that is growing fast.
I think there's an eBay link for Nintendo coming into the chat for you later on, if you this is public outreach.
Is that right? Well, I would have to give them my child at this moment. And actually, at this time in quarantine, I would. Would you like them both now?
But no. So building on that, I mean, John or Dale or Chester, did you guys see other? Because I think, you know, the people who are staying up and watching this this webinar would be interested to see if there are opportunities. So, for example, in the medical space that you exist in, Dale, are there needs, for example, that can be satisfied by some of the potential participants here? Are there things that you see opportunities in? For example, localized PPE has obviously been starting to take off. Any other types of opportunities that you see in, or maybe what is the new normal that you see us tending towards? And I think you're mute again. Sorry.
Trap that one. I think it's about your imagination, really. Everyone knows the same formula. The obvious stuff is, you know, PPE, and if you wanted to speculate, you can look at tests and you can look at drugs and vaccines. But you know, which company and who are you going to hit the jackpot with? Other things along the lines of what Joanne says. I think outreach type care. Whether it's, you know, home-based nursing, home-based delivery of services, telemedicine, all these types of things that are sort of modifications of of how we deliver care now. I guess they're the main ones. I think over the next couple of years, I'd also just say I'm fairly, I guess, pessimistic about how this is going to go. I think we're going to get some rude shocks along the way as just how hard this is going to be. I think the world's in a relative celebratory mode at the moment, but what I've always said is that lockdowns work. We know they work. If you stop all human interaction, viruses can't spread. So no one should be patting themselves on the back saying, we've beaten this. And that is a feel that I get, obviously because people are so relieved to be coming out of lockdown. But overconfidence worries me. And the way this virus can spread before you realize that it's happened. Italy went from, or Wuhan, Italy, New York went from very few cases with a sort of a transmission undercurrent, and then suddenly there's a couple of thousand cases and hospitals are overwhelmed. So I think people are going to have to be really smart and really wary, and I think this is a really slippery virus we've got here, and I am a bit pessimistic about the optimism.
Dale, I'll ask you a question that so, a lot of people talk about sort of all or none, hard therapies, like certainly a vaccine that would be nearly protective or highly protective is a great endpoint. Some of the antibody technologies and even plasma, but in terms of things that would not necessarily be curative, but would move the essentially lethality of the virus into a more manageable range. But what do you see coming out there? And maybe that's improved ventilation strategies or other types of improved non-invasive ventilation, or for goodness sakes, not disinfectants, but other types of standard therapies that are available right now and well understood, but applied with best practices. Do you think there's much room for maneuvering there?
Oh yeah. So you mentioned, ICU techniques. Definitely, there's developments coming on there that are very technical, but certainly seem to be very real. So the people that have looked after a lot of COVID ICU patients do actually, have learned things that work. There's a lot of stuff on, anticoagulation and this sort of thing, especially since we're quite disappointed to date with a lot of the antiviral treatments, but immune modulators. There's lots of potential stuff out there, but I don't think anything is going to be a cure. It's not going to be, here's your penicillin for your pneumonia. It's not going to be like that. It's sort of, you do this and you improve the mortality by 20% or something, and people will regard that as a success. And that could even be the way with vaccines. You take this vaccine, and we've found that if you get COVID, it's less severe. It might be something like that. It may not be take this vaccine and you won't get it at all in the rest of your life. Right. Again, like so many things we've said tonight, it's not binary. There's going to be lots of stuff in the middle.
Yeah.
That was a great question. John, did you want to provide any sort of upside things that you're seeing, opportunities, localized?
What I'm inclined to say is that I'm cautiously pessimistic at this point in time. I wish I could be saying that all I can see is upside as we move to the next stage. But as I said, this is not a coordinated pandemic. This is happening in different places at different times. If I can, thinking of the questions that have been coming through. We've got people on the line from Yemen, from parts of Africa, other parts of the pan-Arab world, from America, from Europe. One sad truth that we need to acknowledge, and this is where we need to also focus, is that we know even with Hurricane Katrina, which was a disaster, say in the US, that 60% of SMEs and micro SMEs that closed down then never happened again. So the reason we're so focused on trying to maintain lifelines to so many of these SMEs and micro SMEs, which in a sense are the heartbeat or the blood flow of economies, is the genuine concern we have that many that close will never reopen. And what are we going to do with these people? How are we going to help them? What kind of interventions will we make? Will we simply talk about build back better, or what is it we're actually going to do to enable people to not be left behind here? And so there's a lot of thought that'll need to go into what kind of policy settings, but also, this is what I said before, strong health systems, strong, good, confident governance, and really strong senses of community. And I think we all know there are very few economies in the world where all three operate with some level of synchronicity. What we do need to be mindful of is that there's going to be an awful lot of people who, as Dale said as well, looking down the pipe, are actually going to be forced to work out how they do manage themselves back into the workflow, create new businesses, or even just find a livelihood for them. And so, in a way, the good news is that if you can actually focus on these issues and not ignore them, you might actually have a prospect of doing something about it. The better news is that we're now in the 21st century and there are new tools available to support people. One of the truths that will come out of this, and I think we're already seeing it now, is the reliance upon the digital platform. How can we ensure, therefore, that there's maximum amount of connectedness to the digital platform? That's going to be a key. You do not want technology not for all here. You do not want a technology divide when you know that, particularly in Africa and elsewhere, if we're able to connect people up, then there's a higher probability of them being able to participate and build a meaningful life. So there's lots of kind of policy issues, and these are not necessarily global issues, save for the fact that the last thing we want at this point in time is a bifurcated digital platform. We actually would like to have a properly curated and globally governed digital platform for the very good reason that it could actually create opportunities for people. And if nothing else, it may be able to enable people to get access to finance support and services. So look, I suppose a bit of a mixed bag on this issue. I mean, as a business person, I always want to see optimistic course of action. And I can, in a way, see a course of action here. But I'm very grounded in the reality of the tragedy that occur in human beings' lives, and our obligation in order to live up to the, I suppose, the purpose of the ICC to enable business worldwide to secure peace, prosperity, and opportunity for all. We actually want to help businesses survive and rebuild so that they can actually employ people, create support for communities and families, and actually build better societies. But we need to ensure that the business settings which emerge from this are also conducive to that. And that's another element that we're very focused on at the moment. We don't think state-driven economies will actually enable the kind of enabling environment, a strong private sector to emerge, and a strong private sector is critical to delivering peace, prosperity, and opportunity for all. But we will work, that's what we want to work on.
John, can I pose a question?
Yeah, sure.
So in the global financial crisis, that meltdown essentially came from inside the financial community outwards. So you had extreme leverage in some extremely large financial institutions, and when one domino started to tip, it had a massive propagating effect through the financial industry. But in this setting, it's a little bit different. The shock is coming from outside the finance industry as a material shock, with the finance industry now, even with a bit more control measures in terms of capital securitization, et cetera. So my question is, as small businesses seek to recover, do you think that the implied or retained efficiency of the financial system will help capital flows into a more efficient rebuilding, as in theory finance should? I mean, it should guide capital to where it's best used. Are you optimistic about that connection in in rebuilding after some of these problems?
I think that that will be one of the obligations on the financial sector to support an efficient allocation and access to. However, I would say at a broad level, in the initial stages, as mixed up as this whole crisis is, that has not been the experience, I think, of small, medium and micro enterprises. What you're seeing is and you're seeing this with large companies as well, leaders in the supply chains, their determination to actually avoid any risk to liquidity, avoid any risk to their companies, have actually emboldened them or required them or allowed them or forced themselves, whatever. They've taken actions in their own interests, the consequences of which sometimes are beneficial on the supply chain, but often not. And what you're seeing is collapses of supply chains, the manipulation or utilization and force majeure clauses in ways that weren't expected. There's a lot of stuff going on there. As I said, this may be stage one, and I tried to describe that before. It's a bit like the oxygen tent comes down in the plane and you look after yourself and then you look to your neighbor. I'm encouraged to hope that that will be the next stage, because the reality is that big business also needs small business, that a functioning financial sector requires people to actually be involved in commerce as well, and therefore to enable that. But we need to ensure that the policy settings and the expectation of society is well understood. And that's going to be a very interesting part of the recovery debate. What are the expectations of society, of businesses? What are the expectations of business, of different sectors of the business community? What is government's expectations? What is the citizen's expectation of government? What is business's expectation of government? These are all elements we see as part of the debate that we, as I said, it'd be nice if it was all sequential. We'll get around to that in 2 years' time. But that debate's happening now, particularly as governments have intervened in a much more direct way in economies. Most people would say we would not like to see that as a permanent feature.
Yeah. Can I just ask, just to add on a little bit to that, I think we're also seeing, coming back to what Dale said, I think that it's ultimately a question also of how creative you are, because we are seeing some of the financing strategies outside the mainstream financial sector. So for example, people setting up gift cards or small businesses asking people to basically pay it forward, so to have this mechanism by which they're raising funds today for services that will be rendered later, and that's being done entirely outside the formal financial system. But I did also want to ask a question back to you, John, about the formal and informal sector. And my question is sort of related to this idea of the health system itself. And what we know is that we have many countries in which we have both an informal economy and an informal health system, and they are one and the same. So we have very many countries in which we have the luxury of a healthcare system that is very organized, highly formal, and run, like an NHS or like Singapore. But in countries like Africa, we have a very large and thriving healthcare system, which is largely small providers, which are non-profit systems. And so in some sense, the businesses that we're talking about are actually also the healthcare system, or a very large fraction of the healthcare system, or they actually serve a very large fraction of the population, which is at its most vulnerable. So is there anything that we're seeing now at the ICC level to think about the private sector for health, and in particular the private sector, the informal private sector for health in some of these countries?
Absolutely. In fact, I'm sure you're part of different conversations which are taking place in WhatsApp groups, etc. We are actually seeing the private sector, particularly large employers or the private sector with multiple sites in, for example, a challenging region like Africa, start to invest in building its own hospitals, its own health system, their own health systems. Not because they don't want governments to be strong, but what they actually want is to step in and ensure that the communities in which they operate are well served. So that is happening. I do think that there's a legitimate debate which is already running around universal access to health, that it would be great if the private sector was more engaged or able to be more engaged in that debate. And there's some inhibitors on that because the WHO has lots of restrictions in terms of its capacity to engage with the private sector. We're very pleased they saw fit, Tedros saw fit, and because he recognised the need to engage with the private sector, to engage with us, but we're in a sense, we're a not-for-profit, etc., but very, very large. But there should be an assumption from the institution that the private sector is only interested in engaging in health issues for its own profit. It's actually often engaged in public policy issues to create a stronger public good, which it can then, in terms of the commons, create opportunity from. There is actually there's genuine interest in that kind of debate as well, and that's similar with digital and things like that as well. But certainly in this health space, I think to build those kind of robust health systems, to ensure that communities are well served, particularly where governments don't have the capacity to invest at the level required to have that sustainable health system, and engagement with the private sector, or a recognition of standards which the private sector must meet in order to service it. That I think it's an essential part of the discussion.
So basically, one of the questions which came through, and I'm already being called RoboCop, Lord Vader. Thank you, guys. Actually, Tomas, what's unfortunate is the prior chat has not loaded in my chat. But one of the questions I think for Dale was around the positive rate. So this was a question that came out of South Africa. They were talking about reintroducing, coming out of lockdown, and being particularly a lot of asymptomatic people, and then some of the positive rates indicating that there was more penetration of COVID-19. Just wanted any thoughts or comments on some of the data coming out of Iceland, etc.
Yeah, this is really tricky. You've got a chance if the disease has symptoms, but when you get pre-symptomatic people and asymptomatic, which are slightly different, but basically people without symptoms that can spread, that's similar to flu and chickenpox, and we know how they can spread. So it's it will be a problem going forward. What it means is that once you start to see cases, you'll start to see unlinked cases, and then you'll get on that exponential curve. Now, and that's why you can sort of have an apparently okay society, but then suddenly you've got all these cases. So that's the Wuhan, Italy, New York scenario. So what it means is that we cannot do without social restrictions completely. There will always need to be social restrictions, as long as we care about COVID-19, and that's where you get into this, degree. Do you shut down completely? Yes, that works. Can we just open everything up and stay a meter away? Yes. Are we going to turn into societies where everyone has to wear a mask just on the off chance that I'm an asymptomatic case, so I'd better wear a mask, because it's more about source control than protecting yourself, as I think most people are grasping now. I don't want to live in a society where everyone goes around wearing a mask all the time. But can we all stay a meter or two apart? Can there be so much hand rub around that if you touch something contaminated, we're always washing our hands? This is what we're going to find out in the next 3 or 4 months, I think. How much level of social restriction you need to live with because of this brewing asymptomatic, pre-symptomatic infection, which leads to that exponential growth, and then you're back where you started.
And did you have any comments on, what you think potentially the type of, so for example, the positive rate in New York, they were saying was between 20 to 30%. Do you actually think that it's potentially more widespread than is currently being indicated?
So you're talking about antibody studies?
Yes, correct.
I don't know every antibody study. I don't think general community is 20 or 30%. It's obviously if you get to a point where you've reached herd immunity, that's fine. But most of us believe to get to herd immunity, you need an incredible amount of carnage. And, I don't think New York's had enough carnage to get to herd immunity. Does New York want to go through that another dozen times to get to herd immunity? I doubt it. But we've still got a lot to learn on these seroprevalence studies as well.
Yep.
Understood. Another question.
I've got to jump off. So thanks.
So John, if you need to drop off, don't click the red button. Just close the browser.
Not the red button, John.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, whatever you do, don't hit the red button.
Do it to us all. So Joe, one question that maybe you might want to field. We've seen a global carbon emission. This is from Vinod Kesava. We've seen a global carbon emissions reduce significantly due to COVID-19. Will global emissions continue to rise? Will there be a catch-up game? What's the new normal?
Well, I'm not an environmentally conscious, let me just say, so this would be entirely speculative on my part. I think that for us to see this, it's been a demonstration for us that this actually can happen. I think there's been a little bit of an overreaction to the environmental gains because people are so desperate for good news, to be honest. It's late, I have to be very frank.
Dolphins swimming around in Venice, etc.
Exactly. But I do think that it has shown us the magnitude of what it would take for us to quickly reverse it, and that there actually are not going to be any easy answers for climate change. And I actually think that at the end of the day, what this should actually teach us about is that sometime soon, there will be, in soon being in the nature of human history, that there will be another virus that will come along, and it's going to look like this and worse. And if we haven't learned anything about how to respond to it, this will all have been for nothing. And climate change is something that's going to, antimicrobial resistance is going to creep up on us. Climate change is going to creep up on us. If we haven't seen this as a demonstration case of how we respond to things that we are not able to imagine in the day-to-day, then that's going to be a problem.
Dale, I'll ask you to follow up on Joanne's comment. I mean, you're an admitted somewhat of a pessimist, but I can see underneath that nice dinner jacket lies the heart of an optimist trying to get out. So, when you think of, you see the world from a relatively high perch, are there themes developing where you're seeing a consciousness of cooperation that's developing in the right direction to solve global problems that maybe didn't exist last year?
So I thought Joanne put a new level to my pessimism. Starting to talk about the next virus. I went, Jesus, can't we finish this one first?
Well, you need a job. I mean, you got to have something.
No, I'm hanging up my...
No, Economist, this is called the dismal science for a reason.
I'm not going to be around for the next outbreak. This will do me. This whole back to nature thing is... I think it's a treat, actually. I think it's really fun seeing the dolphins and the fish and the clear blue skies. And I can tell you when I landed in Beijing, that was the first thing that struck me. No cars, no people, and a clear blue sky. And I thought, wow. And now we're seeing it now. And I'm just driving around Singapore today and just going, the skies aren't normally this blue.
Yeah.
And I go outside to get my car out to work, and I can hear birds tweeting, and I go, I never heard those birds before. So, I think it's a special treat. I have to say I'm with Joanne on this, though. I don't think people are running around. I don't hear people running around saying, let's leave it like this because it's so nice. This is how nature should be. I hear people running around saying, I want to get back on a plane. I want to go and visit people. I want to open my business. I want to get back into a nightclub. So I think I look on this as a special treat that I'll always remember. But I think it won't stay. Maybe it'll stay a bit.
We hope.
That's the TV coming out, I think.
I think that honestly, Dale, I would never have expected that final comment from you. But believe it or not, I was one of Time Magazine's Heroes of the Environment, and I do a lot of environmental work. So actually, we have a working group looking at how COVID-19 is the chance to hit the reset button for
Yeah.
climate change action and what is the new normal. So I didn't realize there was going to be a follow-up panel, but given your sense of optimism for the world and for the environment, thank you for confirming to be on the COVID-19 climate change panel.
No.
I think
Go there.
I think we're almost at the end of our time.
More webinars.
There's been the other pandemic I was going to mention was the pandemic of webcasts, and I've got Zoom itches all over my body. But look, thank you so much for everyone's time. If there are any final comments from any of the panelists, please feel free. Any final words, Chester, Joe, and Dale?
And I think I would just say, in 2008, there's a popular phrase of roughly, never waste a good crisis. And the upshot of that is, when things are broken, really think about how you can put them together in a way that was better before. And I think that if at all possible, certainly if there are leaders on this call and ourselves in addition, to think about how systems can be rebuilt over the long term using some of this disruption. Maybe the integral of that entire change could eventually be for the good, even if it's a bit hard to see now.
Very optimistic from you, Chester. Thank you, Joe. Are you going to keep the mood up? I'm feeling it.
Sure. I'd say that just to come back to one of the themes I think we've heard about today, that there's all this uncertainty, and how can leaders make decisions under uncertainty? And my sense is that that's what leaders are supposed to do. That's your job, is to make decisions under uncertainty, right? And at the end of the day, I don't know who it was who said it, but they do say that, being clear-eyed about risk is one thing, but optimism is the great moral courage. So there we go. And that's what we need to take.
That's wonderful. And Dale, any final words?
Well, not after Joanne just said that.
That was brilliant.
Tough act to follow. No, I think I sort of say, enjoy it. It is what it is. There's no point in getting down. If you're locked in and you don't have any work to do and you're bored, then use it as an opportunity to learn something or do something that you've always wanted to do, or get fit or something. If you are working or struggling, I think nimble, adaptive. I think there's opportunities. In some ways, maybe we all should enjoy a new lease of life and new opportunities, and staying positive, whether it's in your business or in your social life. So I think. It sounds weird. I'm not sure I came into this webinar thinking I would say enjoy the moment, but nor did I.
I knew there was a heart of gold underneath there.
Thank
for
you,
sure.
Chester. You did what I could not do, and I think we're all blinded by the brilliance. No, thank you so much. This has been a phenomenal panel, and John, if he was here, I'm sure he's looking down at us from webinar heaven. But thank you so much. I really appreciate all the questions. We've had an amazing retention rate, and thank you for everyone's time. Thomas, the mic is yours.
Great, thank you. I want to thank also all the speakers for your time and the audience for their questions. So as a reminder, we do host these live broadcasts on this topic in addition to other trade topics like the Incoterms rules, cryptocurrency, leadership coaching, and many others. So sign up on our website for free and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And ladies and gentlemen, this has been another episode of the COVID-19 Briefing. See you next time.